Sometimes the cruelest thing we do is turn our backs on those who need us most. In the unforgiving territory of the Old West, a lone mountain woman discovers a young girl abandoned beneath a dead tree, left to die with a sign declaring her too wild for man. The settlements cast her out, decided she was worthless, unfit for decent society. But this mountain woman sees something different. She cuts the girl free and takes her into the high country, away from the judgment and cruelty below. What happens next will force an entire frontier community to face what they've done. What could make people abandon one of their own to such a terrible fate? Before we head back to that harsh land, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story speaks to you, subscribe, because tomorrow I have something special waiting for you. The high country of Montana Territory held on to winter longer than most places, and Sarah Killian preferred it that way. At 52, she'd earned her solitude in these mountains, paid for it with losses that still ached in her chest when the wind blew cold through the pines. Her cabin sat tucked into a narrow valley where few men ventured, accessible only by a trail she'd deliberately left unmarked. The nearest settlement, Redemption Flats, lay 3 days' ride to the southeast, and that distance suited her just fine. She'd built the cabin herself after James died, after Mary died, after everything that mattered had been buried in the hard ground of a frontier that measured worth in all the wrong ways. The structure stood solid against the elements, logs chinked tight with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly even in the worst weather. Inside, she kept it spare but comfortable. A bed with a quilt Mary had made before things went wrong. A table and 2 chairs, though she rarely had use for the second. Shelves lined with books James had collected, their spines faded but their words still sharp. Hanging from pegs near the door, her tools of survival, a Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver, knives of various sizes, and the worn leather satchel that held her medicines and the one photograph she couldn't bear to part with. The satchel was open now on the table, and Sarah was taking inventory. Willow bark for pain, yarrow for wounds, comfrey root, dried sage, bandages she'd torn from old shirts and boiled clean. Her grandmother had taught her the healing arts, passed down through generations of women who understood that frontier doctors were scarce and often useless. Sarah had added to that knowledge over the years, learning from Shoshone women she'd traded with, from trial and error, from desperation when Mary lay dying and no one would help. She tucked the tin-type photograph deeper into the satchel's inner pocket, though she'd already memorized every detail. Mary, at 14, standing beside a fence post, her dark hair braided, her smile tentative but real. 2 years before the pregnancy, 3 years before the grave. Sarah's fingers lingered on the leather for a moment, then she closed the flap with practiced efficiency. Sentiment was a luxury, and she had supplies to gather. The quarterly trip to the settlements was necessary, if unpleasant. She needed salt, flour, coffee, ammunition, things she couldn't make or grow or hunt. She'd trade for them with the dried venison and elk she'd preserved, the fur pelts she'd cured, the medicinal tinctures she prepared better than any apothecary. The merchants would take her goods readily enough. The townsfolk would nod politely and keep their distance. Sarah Killian was respected for her skills, but not welcomed. A woman alone, a woman who defied their judgment of her daughter, a woman who chose the wild over their civilization. They didn't trust what they couldn't control. She packed her saddlebags methodically. Bedroll, dried meat, canteen. The Spencer rifle would ride in its scabbard on the mule, and the Colt would stay on her hip. The territory between her cabin and the settlements wasn't particularly dangerous, but carelessness got people killed. She'd seen it happen. She'd buried her share. By first light, Sarah was mounted on her mare, a sturdy Appaloosa named Sage who'd been with her for 8 years. The pack mule, Solomon, plodded behind, loaded but not overburdened. The morning air carried the scent of pine and earth, and somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled. Sarah breathed it in, storing the peace of it, knowing the next few days would test her patience. The descent from the high country took most of the day. The trail wound through dense forest, crossed 3 streams still running with snowmelt, and eventually opened onto the rolling grasslands that stretched toward the settlements. Sarah took her time, let the animals graze when they needed, made camp that first night beside a creek she knew well. She built a small fire, boiled coffee, ate jerky and hardtack while the stars emerged overhead. This was the life she'd chosen. Not the one she'd imagined as a young woman married to a territorial marshal, not the one she'd hoped for when Mary was born. But it was hers, and it was honest. The second day brought her within sight of Redemption Flats, though she wouldn't reach it until tomorrow. She camped in a copse of cottonwoods, the kind that grew along dry creek beds and offered shade without much else. The settlements were visible in the distance, 3 separate communities within a few hours' ride of each other. Redemption Flats was the largest, with a main street, a church, a general store, a saloon. Iron Creek to the north was smaller, mostly families. Stillwater to the west served the ranchers. Together they formed a loose confederation of frontier society, bound by shared hardship and rigid codes. Sarah had lived among them once. James had been marshal for all 3 settlements, respected and feared in equal measure. He'd enforced the law fairly, which made him enemies among those who preferred their own version of justice. When he'd arrested 3 ranchers for rustling, they'd ambushed him on the road to Stillwater, shot him in the back. By the time Sarah reached him, he was already gone, his badge still pinned to his chest, his eyes open to a sky that offered no answers. Mary had been 15 then. The loss of her father broke something in her, made her reckless in her grief. She'd taken up with a drifter passing through, a man with kind words and empty promises. He'd left her pregnant and alone. The town's judgment came swift and merciless. Mary was a sinner. Sarah had failed as a mother. The preacher refused to let Mary worship. The doctor refused to attend her when the baby came too early and wrong. Sarah had tried everything she knew, every remedy, every prayer she'd abandoned years before. It wasn't enough. Mary bled out in that same bed where Sarah now slept alone, crying for her father, begging forgiveness for sins that weren't hers to carry. The baby, a boy, lived for 3 hours, long enough for Sarah to hold him, to see James in his tiny features, to bury him beside his mother in ground that was still frozen. The town had offered condolences that rang hollow. They'd made it clear in a dozen small ways that Mary's death was a consequence of her choices. God's will. Natural order. Sarah had packed what mattered, burned what didn't, and walked away. Let them have their judgments and their certainties. She wanted no part of their version of righteousness. That was 7 years ago. In that time, she'd returned quarterly for supplies, kept her interactions brief and transactional, and never stayed longer than necessary. The merchants knew her. A few remembered James with genuine respect. Most simply took her trade goods and gave her what she needed in return. She didn't ask for more than that. But tomorrow, descending into Redemption Flats again, she'd have to walk those streets where Mary had been shamed. Past the church that had turned them away, past the doctor's office where help had been denied. She'd do it because survival required it, because isolation had its costs, because even in her chosen solitude, she couldn't exist entirely apart from the world. Sarah checked her weapons one more time before settling in for the night. The Colt was clean and loaded. The Spencer, too. Not because she expected trouble, but because the frontier taught you to be ready for it anyway. She lay back against her saddle, pulled her blanket up, and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. In the morning, she'd face the settlements again, trade her goods, keep her distance, return to the high country where the only judgments that mattered were whether you could survive the winter and whether you treated the land with respect. It was enough. It had to be. The stars offered no comment, which Sarah appreciated. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the night settle over her. Crickets, the soft movement of the animals, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Tonight, she had peace. She'd learned to take it where she could find it. The third morning dawned hot and still, the kind of day where the sun pressed down like a weight and the air shimmered over the grasslands. Sarah was in the saddle before full light, wanting to reach Redemption Flats, conduct her business, and be gone before the heat of the afternoon. The settlements had a way of feeling smaller and meaner in the full blaze of summer, and she had no desire to linger. She was perhaps 2 hours from town when she saw the cottonwood tree standing alone in the middle of the plain. It was dead, had been for years probably, struck by lightning and left as a stark skeleton against the pale sky. Nothing unusual about that. The frontier was littered with the bones of things that hadn't survived, but something about this particular tree pulled at her attention. Something dark hanging from one of its lower branches. Sarah reined Sage to a stop, squinting against the brightness. The mule bumped into the mare's hindquarters, impatient to keep moving. She sat still for a long moment, studying the shape. Too large for a coyote carcass, too still for anything alive. Her gut tightened with a familiar dread, the kind that came from years of finding things on the frontier that shouldn't be found. She urged Sage forward slowly, one hand dropping to rest on the colt at her hip. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into something worse than she'd imagined. A young woman, bound to the trunk of the tree with iron shackles at her wrists and ankles. Her head hung forward, dark hair obscuring her face. Above her, nailed to the dead wood with 3 crude spikes, was a hand-painted sign, "Too wild for man." Sarah's breath caught. She'd seen frontier justice before, seen men hanged for crimes real and invented, seen women pilloried for adultery or witchcraft or simply being inconvenient. But this was something else. This was deliberate abandonment, a death sentence carried out slowly under the sun. She dismounted before she'd made a conscious decision to do so, her boots hitting the hard ground with purpose. The girl, and she was young, Sarah could see that now, didn't move as Sarah approached. Her skin was burned raw by the sun, lips cracked and bleeding, her dress torn and filthy. She was heavy-set, her body straining against fabric that had never been kind to her shape. Sarah could see the marks where the shackles had rubbed her wrists bloody, see the way her chest barely moved with shallow breaths. "Can you hear me?" Sarah kept her voice low and steady, the way you'd talk to a wounded animal. "I'm going to help you." The girl's eyes opened, just barely. They were blue, startling against the ruin of her sunburned face. Terror lived in those eyes, and something else. Resignation. She'd stopped expecting rescue. Sarah recognized that look. She'd seen it in Mary's eyes near the end. Sarah moved quickly, pulling her canteen from Sage's saddle. She held it to the girl's lips, letting water trickle slowly. The girl choked, coughed, then drank with desperate gulps. Sarah had to pull the canteen away before she made herself sick. "Easy now. Too much at once will just come back up." She examined the shackles. They were old, rust-pitted iron, the kind that had probably been used on slaves before the war. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to find them, to bring them here, to lock this girl to a tree in the middle of nowhere and leave her to die. The rage that built in Sarah's chest was cold and familiar. She pulled her largest knife from her belt. The lock on the shackles was crude but solid. It would take time, she didn't have to pick it, and the girl didn't have time at all. Sarah wedged the blade into the gap between the iron and the tree trunk, using it as a lever. The wood was brittle with age and death. It gave way in chunks. "This is going to hurt," she warned. Then she wrenched the blade hard. The iron pulled free from the tree with a screech of metal on wood. The girl cried out, sagging forward into Sarah's arms. Her weight was substantial, dead weight of someone who had no strength left. Sarah caught her, eased her down to the ground. and went to work on her ankles. It was then she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving at an easy pace. Sarah's hand went to her colt, but she didn't draw. Not yet. She positioned herself between the girl and whoever was coming, still working at the ankle shackles. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer. Men from Redemption Flats. Sarah recognized them from previous trips. The one in front was Deputy Marshal Tucker, a man in his 30s with a face that revealed nothing. Behind him rode 2 others she didn't know by name but knew by type. Ranchers or farmers, men who made their living from hard ground and harder certainties. Tucker reined up about 20 feet away. His eyes moved from Sarah to the girl to the sign nailed above them. His expression didn't change. "Mrs. Killian, didn't expect to find you out this way." "Deputy." Sarah got the second ankle shackle free and stood slowly, keeping herself between the men and the girl. "Found this young woman in need of help." "That's Emma Wheaton." Tucker's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. She was judged by the town council and the church. Her punishment was decided proper and legal. Legal. Sarah tasted the word like poison. "You mean you all agreed to chain a girl to a tree and let her die of thirst? She brought it on herself." One of the other men spoke up, his tone defensive. "Got herself engaged to the sheriff's boy, then when her true nature showed. Gluttony, laziness, defiance." He broke it off. "She wouldn't accept the judgment of decent folks. Kept causing trouble, saying things she shouldn't. The council decided she needed to be removed from society." Sarah looked at the girl, Emma, crumpled on the ground, barely conscious. This was their idea of justice. This was what they called righteous. The cold rage in her chest spread through her limbs, but she kept her voice level. "I'm taking her with me." "Can't let you do that, ma'am." Tucker's hand rested on his own sidearm now, casual but clear. "She's under sentence. You interfere, you're breaking territorial law." "Then I'm breaking it." Sarah met his eyes without blinking. "You going to shoot me, deputy, out here where there's witnesses?" She nodded toward the other 2 men, who suddenly looked less certain. "Or are you going to ride back and tell Sheriff Marsh that you let me take her, because you didn't want to murder a woman in cold blood for the crime of showing mercy?" The silence stretched out, broken only by the labored breathing of the girl on the ground and the restless movement of the horses. Tucker's jaw worked, and Sarah could see him calculating. She was a known quantity, the widow of Marshal James Killian, a man who'd been respected even if he was dead. She lived outside the settlements but hadn't caused trouble. And more importantly, she was standing there with her hand near her gun, and Tucker was smart enough to know she'd use it if pushed. "This ain't over," he said finally. "Sheriff will want words with you. He knows where to find me." Sarah didn't move until the 3 men turned their horses and rode back toward Redemption Flats. She watched them until they were small against the horizon, then finally let out the breath she'd been holding. She turned back to Emma, who was watching her with those startling blue eyes. There was a question in them, the same one Mary had asked years ago when the doctor turned them away. Why would anyone help? "Can you ride?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. Emma shook her head weakly. "Then we'll make it work." Sarah brought Sage over, managed to get Emma onto the mare's back with considerable effort and some muffled cries of pain from them both. She lashed Emma's hands to the saddle horn with a soft rope, gentle but secure. "You fall off, you'll hurt yourself worse. Hold on best you can." Sarah mounted Solomon the mule, took Sage's reins, and turned away from Redemption Flats. Away from the settlements, away from their laws and judgments, back toward the high country where cruelty didn't dress itself up as righteousness. Behind them, the dead cottonwood stood sentinel in the empty plain, its sign still proclaiming its message to no one. Sarah didn't look back. She'd made her choice the moment she saw that sign, maybe even before that. Some things couldn't be walked away from, even when walking away had been your whole life for 7 years. Emma slumped forward against the saddle horn, barely conscious. Sarah kept the pace slow and steady, watching the girl, watching the horizon, watching for signs of pursuit. The sun climbed higher, brutal and unforgiving. They had a long way to go, and Sarah knew the settlements wouldn't let this stand. But that was tomorrow's trouble. Today, she'd cut a girl free from chains and pointed them both toward something like safety. It would have to be enough. 3 weeks after Sarah had brought Emma to the cabin, a rider appeared on the trail from the lowlands. Sarah spotted him from the ridge where she was checking her snares, a lone figure on horseback moving with purpose toward her hidden valley. She watched for a few minutes, noting the steady pace, the direct route that suggested someone who knew exactly where he was going. Then she headed back to warn Emma. The girl was in the cabin, kneading bread dough with growing confidence. She'd gained back some weight in the past weeks, her face filling out, color returning to her skin. The burns had healed to pink scars that would fade with time. More importantly, some light had returned to her eyes, though fear still lived there too. "Rider coming," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm. "Just one, probably bringing a message from the settlements." Emma's hands stilled in the dough, her face going pale. "They're coming for me. Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, we'll deal with it." Sarah pulled her rifle from its place by the door, checked that it was loaded. "Keep working on that bread. Show whoever it is that you're not hiding or afraid." The rider arrived an hour later. He was young, perhaps 17, with the gangly frame of someone still growing into his height. Sarah recognized him from her trips to Redemption Flats, Thomas Brennan, son of the general store owner. A good kid, polite, who'd always treated her fairly. "Mrs. Killian," he called from the edge of the clearing, staying mounted. "I've got a letter for you, from the town council. Light down, Thomas. I'll put coffee on." Sarah kept the rifle visible but not aimed. The boy was just a messenger, and shooting the messenger never solved anything. Thomas dismounted, tying his horse to a post. He followed Sarah into the cabin, his eyes going immediately to Emma, who was shaping the dough into loaves with hands that only trembled slightly. Recognition flickered across his face, then something that might have been sympathy. "Miss Emma," he said quietly, nodding to her. Emma didn't respond, but she met his eyes before returning to her work. Sarah poured coffee, set out 3 cups, and gestured for Thomas to sit at the table. He pulled an envelope from inside his coat, laying it on the worn wood between them. "I'm supposed to wait for a response," he said. Sarah opened the envelope, unfolding the paper inside. The letter was written in a careful, formal hand, probably by Deacon Marsh himself. She read it slowly, her expression unchanging, though anger built with each line. The letter demanded Emma's immediate return to Redemption Flats for proper spiritual rehabilitation under the guidance of the church. It stated that Sarah's interference with a lawful sentence was a violation of territorial law and community standards. It warned that continued defiance would result in serious consequences, including possible charges of obstructions and harboring a fugitive. It concluded with an appeal to Sarah's Christian duty and her responsibility as a member of the frontier community to uphold proper moral standards. Sarah set the letter down, took a sip of coffee, and looked at Thomas. "Tell me something, son. You were there when they took Emma?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, ma'am. I was sweeping the store's front steps when they brought her through town." "What did you think of it?" The boy looked down at his cup. "Didn't seem right, ma'am. Emma never hurt nobody. She just asked questions that made folks uncomfortable. My pa said sometimes the righteous get too righteous for their own good, but he said it quiet, where nobody else could hear. Your pa's a wise man." Sarah pushed the letter across the table. "You read this?" "No, ma'am. Sealed when they gave it to me." It says I have to send Emma back. Says it's my Christian duty. Sarah's voice was conversational, almost mild. Tell me, Thomas, you read your Bible regular? Yes, ma'am. Every Sunday in church. Then you remember the part about the Good Samaritan. Man lying beaten on the road, priests and Levites walking past him, too busy with their important business to stop and help? Thomas nodded slowly, seeing where this was going. I figure I'm the Samaritan in this story. Found a girl left to die, and I helped her. That seems pretty Christian to me. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Now your deacon wants me to send her back so they can finish what they started. You think Jesus would approve of that? The boy said nothing, but conflict was written clear on his young face. He'd been raised to respect authority, to follow the teachings of the church, to believe that the council and the deacon knew best. But he also had eyes to see and a heart that wasn't completely hardened yet. Emma spoke then, her voice stronger than Sarah had heard it. Thomas, you remember when your little sister got sick last winter? The fever that wouldn't break? Of course. My mother made the poultice that saved her. Brought it to your house herself, stayed up all night helping your ma nurse her through the worst of it. Emma met his eyes steadily. 2 months later, my mother stood in the town square and didn't say a word while they locked me in chains. Fear makes cowards of good people. Thomas looked stricken. I'm sorry, Miss Emma. I know you didn't. Most folks didn't do anything because they were afraid they'd be next. Emma turned back to her bread. I'm not going back, Thomas. You can tell them that. Sarah stood, walked to her desk, and pulled out paper and pencil. She wrote quickly, her hand steady, then folded the paper and handed it to Thomas. This is my response. You give it directly to Deacon Marsh. Not the sheriff, not anyone else. You understand? Yes, ma'am. Thomas took the paper, tucked it in his coat. He stood, draining the last of his coffee. At the door he paused. Mrs. Killian? Miss Emma, I hope you'll be all right. After he'd gone, Emma asked, What did you write? Sarah poured herself more coffee, considering how much to share. Finally, she pulled out the letter again and read it aloud. It was brief and direct. Emma Wheaton is under my protection. She will not be returning to Redemption Flats unless she chooses to do so. If you take issue with this, you know where to find me. But I suggest you consider carefully whether you want to test a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Sarah Killian. Emma's eyes widened. They'll come. Probably. Sarah set the letter in the stove, watching it catch fire. But we have time to prepare, and girl, we're going to use every bit of it. Over the following days, Sarah began Emma's education in survival. How to shoot straight, both rifle and pistol. How to track game and read signs on the trail. How to move quietly through the forest. How to find water, build shelter, start fire in the rain. Emma took to it with surprising aptitude, her body growing stronger with the work, her confidence building with each new skill mastered. Sarah taught her to ride properly too, not just sitting passive on a horse, but actually controlling the animal, reading its moods, becoming one with its movement. Emma fell off more than once, but she got back up, determined in a way that reminded Sarah of herself at that age. In the evenings, they planned. Sarah drew maps of the high country, showing Emma the trails and hiding places, the water sources and game paths. She explained the patterns of the settlements, who could be trusted and who couldn't, what signs to watch for if men came hunting. I won't let them take you, Sarah said one night, cleaning her rifle by lamplight. But you need to be ready to save yourself if it comes to that. I'm getting old, Emma. I might not always be there. You're not old, Emma protested. You're stronger than most men half your age. I'm 52, and I've lived a hard life. My body remembers every bit of it. Sarah held up the rifle, sighting down the barrel. Point is, you can't depend on anyone but yourself in the end. I'm teaching you to stand on your own feet because that's the greatest gift I can give you. Emma nodded, understanding. She picked up her own rifle, mimicking Sarah's movements, her hands steady on the wood and metal. 3 weeks ago, she'd been dying under a dead tree. Now she was learning to fight back. The transformation wasn't complete yet. Emma still flinched at loud noises, still had nightmares that woke her crying. But she was healing in ways that went deeper than just her body. She was reclaiming herself, piece by piece, from the people who'd tried to convince her she was worthless. And Sarah, who'd spent 7 years alone with her grief, found something she hadn't expected: purpose. Not just in saving Emma, but in teaching her, shaping her, helping her become someone who could face down the world that had tried to break her. The settlements would come eventually. Sarah had no illusions about that. But when they did, they'd find 2 women ready to stand their ground. A month after the letter, Sarah decided it was time to show Emma the full truth of who she'd been before the mountains claimed her. She opened the old trunk at the foot of her bed, the one that had sat untouched for years, and pulled out a tin star, tarnished with age but still recognizable. A territorial marshal's badge. Emma picked it up carefully, turning it in the lamplight. "I don't understand. I thought your husband was the marshal." "He was. James wore that badge for 12 years, but before that it was mine." Sarah settled into her chair, the memories rising like ghosts. "I was one of the first women marshals in Montana Territory. Deputized in '68 back when they needed anyone who could shoot straight and wasn't afraid of hard men. Served for 4 years before I married James and passed the badge to him." "You were a lawman?" "I was the law in 3 counties. Sarah's voice carried both pride and old pain. "I hunted outlaws, broke up range wars, kept the peace when men twice my size wanted to break it. I was good at it, Emma. Real good. Had to be, being a woman. Any mistake, any sign of weakness, and they'd have used it to prove I didn't belong." Emma sat down across from her, the badge still in her hands. "What happened?" "Life happened. I fell in love with a good man who wore a badge himself. We married, and I figured I'd served my time. Let him carry the weight of the law while I kept our home." Sarah's jaw tightened. "But I never forgot how the law worked, or how it didn't work. I watched James try to enforce it fairly, watched him make enemies of powerful men because he wouldn't bend for them. I warned him, told him the ranchers he'd arrested would come for him. He said if he started worrying about threats, he might as well not wear the badge at all." The silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. They ambushed him on the road to Stillwater, shot him in the back, took his horse and guns, left him bleeding in the dirt. By the time I found him, there was nothing to do but hold him while he died. Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. The territorial judge came through 3 months later. I testified, told him exactly who'd done it. The ranchers had alibis. Every man in their employ swore they were somewhere else that day. Judge said there wasn't enough evidence. They got away with murder. They got away with killing a marshal who wouldn't be bought. Sarah took the badge from Emma's hands, ran her thumb over the worn metal. "That's when I learned the law isn't the same as justice. The law is words on paper. Justice is what you make happen when the law fails." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Is that why you helped me? Because the law failed?" "Partly. But also because I knew what the law looked like from the inside. I knew that letter they sent wasn't about legal authority. It was about power. About men who decided you were disposable and didn't like being challenged." Sarah set the badge on the table between them. "They're using the law as a weapon, same as those ranchers did. Difference is, this time I'm not standing by while they do it." Over the following weeks, Sarah shared more of her past. She taught Emma to think like a lawman, how to read situations, anticipate moves, understand the difference between actual threats and empty bluster. She explained the structure of territorial law, what authorities actually had power and which were just pretending. "Sheriff Marsh has jurisdiction in Redemption Flats and the immediate area. Sarah explained one evening, drawing in the dirt outside the cabin. "But up here in the high country, we're in a grey area. No official settlement, no incorporated town. He'd need territorial marshal backing to come after you legally, and that requires paperwork, evidence, formal charges." "Do they have that?" "No. What they have is a council decision and church backing. That carries weight in the settlements, but it's not the law." "Not really." Sarah met Emma's eyes. "Which means if they come for you, they're acting outside their authority, and that changes everything." Emma absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. The frightened girl who'd hung from chains under the sun was becoming someone else, someone harder, more calculating, more dangerous. Sarah saw it happening and didn't try to stop it. The frontier needed hard women as much as it needed hard men, maybe more. They continued Emma's training with new purpose. Sarah taught her not just to shoot, but to shoot well. Quick draws, moving targets, shooting from cover. She taught her hand-to-hand fighting, the kind of dirty, desperate combat that happened when guns were empty or knocked away. Emma took bruises and gave them back, learning that her size could be an advantage if she used it right. "The settlements teach women to be small, quiet, apologetic," Sarah said after a particularly intense sparring session. "But out here, size and strength matter. You're a big woman, Emma. That's not a sin, it's an asset. Use it." Emma straightened, breathing hard, a new light in her eyes. She was discovering power she'd never been allowed to claim before, finding strength in the body she'd been taught to hate. One evening, as they cleaned their rifles together, Emma asked, "If they come, will we fight?" Sarah considered this carefully. "Depends on what they want. If they're here to talk, we'll talk. If they're here to drag you back in chains, then yes, we'll fight. And if we lose, then we lose together." "But Emma," Sarah met her eyes firmly, "I don't plan on losing. I've lost too much already. I'm done letting other people decide what's right when I can see clear as day they're wrong." Emma nodded slowly, then surprised Sarah by reaching out and squeezing her hand. "Thank you for everything, for seeing me as worth fighting for." "You are worth it," Sarah said, and meant it with everything she had. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the badge in the trunk, about the woman she'd been before grief and isolation had claimed her. Maybe Emma wasn't the only one being transformed by their time together. Maybe Sarah was finding pieces of herself she'd thought were lost forever. The fighter, the protector, the woman who'd once stood between chaos and civilization with nothing but a gun and her own conviction that she was doing right. The settlements would come eventually. But Sarah Killian, former territorial marshal, wasn't the same woman who'd retreated to the mountains 7 years ago. She'd been hiding long enough. It was time to stand and fight. 6 weeks after Emma's rescue, a territorial judge arrived in Redemption Flats. Not the corrupt official who'd let James's killers walk free, but a new appointment from back east. His name was Samuel Hartwell, and word of his presence reached Sarah through Thomas Brennan, who'd been making quiet supply runs to her cabin every 2 weeks, bringing news along with flour and coffee. "He's asking questions," Thomas reported, sitting at Sarah's table while Emma poured coffee. "About Emma, about what happened. The council's nervous. Deacon Marsh tried to tell him it was settled business, but the judge said he decides what's settled." Sarah and Emma exchanged glances. This changed things, though, whether for better or worse remained to be seen. "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked. "About the circumstances of Emma's sentencing. About who was present, what evidence was heard, whether she had any chance to defend herself." Thomas looked at Emma. "He asked about your family, Miss Emma. Your mother specifically." Emma's hands stilled on the coffee pot. "What about her?" "She's dead, Miss Emma. Died about 2 weeks after they took you to that tree. Doc said it was her heart, but folks are saying it was grief." Thomas pulled a small leather journal from his coat. My pa found this among her things when he was helping clear the house. He thought you should have it." Emma took the journal with shaking hands. The cover was worn, the pages yellow with age. She opened it carefully, recognizing her mother's cramped handwriting immediately. Sarah watched Emma's face as she read, saw shock and pain and anger flicker across her features. "She knew," Emma whispered. "She knew what they were planning. Wrote it all down." Sarah moved to read over Emma's shoulder. The journal entries were dated, starting 3 months before Emma's sentencing. They painted a picture Sarah had suspected, but hadn't been able to prove, a conspiracy that went deeper than one girl's punishment. The first entries detailed pressure on Emma's mother from Deacon Marsh and Sheriff Marsh. They'd approached her after Robert broke the engagement, suggested that Emma was becoming a problem, that her questions and defiance were corrupting other young women. They wanted Emma's mother to convince her daughter to be quiet, to accept her place, to stop asking uncomfortable questions about church finances and the sheriff's handling of evidence in certain cases. Emma's mother had tried. The journal recorded conversations, pleading with Emma to just conform, to make herself smaller, to survive by surrendering, but Emma had refused, her own conviction stronger than her mother's fear. Then the entries turned darker. The council had decided Emma needed to be made an example of, but they needed the family's cooperation, or at least their silence. Deacon Marsh had made it clear, if Emma's parents didn't support the sentencing, questions would be asked about their own affairs. The store account they'd run up, the property taxes they'd been late paying. Little things, barely legal, the kind of small sins everyone committed, but only some people got punished for. Emma's mother had written it all down, every threat, every pressure, every compromise her conscience screamed against. The final entries were damning. "They're not doing this because Emma is wild," Sarah read aloud. "They're doing it because she knows too much." Last month, she saw the sheriff and the deacon meeting with the ranchers who killed Marshal Killian. She asked her father about it, asked why those men were being treated like respectable citizens when everyone knew what they'd done. Word got back to the sheriff. That's when this all started. They're silencing her because she's dangerous to them. The room went silent. Sarah felt ice settle in her gut as the pieces fell into place. Emma hadn't been punished for gaining weight or asking theological questions. She'd been removed because she'd witnessed evidence of corruption, because she had the courage to point out that the powerful were breaking the laws they claimed to uphold. "I didn't understand," Emma said, her voice hollow. "I thought they hated me because I was fat, because I wasn't pretty enough, because I asked too many questions, but it was about protecting themselves. I was just in the way." "This changes everything," Sarah said, her mind racing through implications. "This isn't frontier justice, however twisted. This is conspiracy, attempted murder to cover up corruption." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "The judge should see this, shouldn't he?" "Maybe." Sarah was cautious. Judges could be bought, influenced, scared off. But something Thomas had said earlier stuck with her. "You said this judge is new, from back east." "Yes, ma'am, appointed by the territorial governor. Some say he was sent specifically because there's been too many complaints about justice out here." Thomas leaned forward. "My pa says he's different. Says he actually listens. Takes notes, asks questions until he gets real answers." Sarah made a decision. "Thomas, you think you could arrange a meeting? Private, away from the settlements? Just the judge, you to vouch for him and us?" "I can try, ma'am." "Do it, and Thomas. Not a word to anyone else. Not your pa, not anyone. You understand? If the sheriff gets wind of this, people will die." The boy's eyes widened, but he nodded. He understood, finally, that this was bigger than one girl's punishment. This was about power and who got to wield it, about justice and who deserved to receive it. After Thomas left, Emma sat at the table with her mother's journal, reading and rereading the entries. Tears ran down her face, But they were different from the tears Sarah had seen before. Not shame or fear, but anger and grief. She knew, Emma said again. She knew it was wrong, and she let them do it anyway. She stood in that square and watched them chain me, and she said nothing. She was afraid, Sarah offered, though it felt inadequate. So was I. I was terrified. But I still spoke up when I saw those men meeting with the sheriff. I still asked why murderers were walking free. Emma looked up, her eyes hard. She chose to protect herself instead of me. That's what fear made her do. Sarah couldn't argue with that. She'd seen it too many times. Good people choosing silence over risk, safety over righteousness. It was how evil men maintained power, by making everyone else too afraid to challenge them. The last entry, Emma said, turning to the final page. She wrote it the day before she died. She says she's sorry. Says she's going to make it right, that she's going to tell the truth. Then nothing. Her heart gave out, Sarah said quietly. Or maybe it was helped along. You start asking to tell the truth to a judge, and suddenly you have an accident or a heart problem or you fall down the stairs. Emma's face paled. You think they killed her? I think it's possible. And I think we need to be very careful about who we trust. Sarah took the journal, wrapped it carefully in oilcloth. This is evidence now, evidence that could hang the sheriff and the deacon both, which means they'll do anything to keep it from seeing daylight. Over the next few days, Sarah and Emma prepared for the meeting with the judge, assuming Thomas could arrange it. They went over the journal together, marking the most damning passages. Sarah drew up a timeline of events, connecting dates and incidents, building a case the way she'd once built cases as a marshal. Emma practiced telling her story, learning to present it clearly and calmly, without the emotion that might make her seem unreliable. Sarah coached her, taught her how to answer questions, how to stick to facts, how to project confidence even when she felt none. They'll try to discredit you, Sarah warned. They'll say you're making it up, that you're a scorned woman seeking revenge, that your weight and behavior prove you're unstable. You have to stay calm, stay factual, let the evidence speak. I can do that, Emma said, and Sarah believed her. The girl who'd been dying under that tree was gone. In her place stood a young woman who'd discovered her own strength, who'd survived attempted murder and learned she was worth fighting for. When Thomas returned a week later with news that Judge Hartwell would meet them at a neutral location, an abandoned line shack halfway between the settlements and Sarah's cabin, both women were ready. They packed carefully, taking the journal, Sarah's old marshal badge, and the shackles that had bound Emma to the tree. Evidence, proof, the truth that powerful men had tried to bury. The night before the meeting, Emma asked, "What if the judge doesn't believe us? What if he's like the last one, protecting the powerful?" "Then we fight," Sarah said simply. "But Emma, I don't think we'll have to. Your mother's journal is too detailed, too specific. And I know something about reading men. I'll know if this judge is honest within 5 minutes of talking to him." Emma nodded, trusting Sarah's judgment. They slept little that night, both aware that tomorrow would determine everything. The settlements thought they'd solve their problem by chaining Emma to a tree and threatening Sarah into silence. They were about to learn that some problems don't die quietly in the desert sun. Some problems fight back. The line shack sat in a clearing surrounded by aspens, their leaves already turning gold with early autumn. It was neutral ground, far enough from the settlements that no one would accidentally stumble upon the meeting, but accessible enough that Judge Hartwell could reach it without arousing suspicion. Sarah and Emma arrived first, as planned, positioning themselves with clear sight lines to the approaches, old habits from Sarah's martial days. Judge Samuel Hartwell arrived precisely at noon, accompanied only by Thomas Brennan and a clerk who carried a leather satchel bulging with papers. Hartwell was in his 50s, gray-bearded, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, He moved with the careful economy of someone who'd spent time in places where wasted motion could get you killed. Not a frontier judge born and raised, but not a soft Eastern fool either. Sarah stepped out from the shack, rifle visible but lowered. "Judge Hartwell, I'm Sarah Killian. This is Emma Wheaton." Hartwell's eyes went to Emma, studying her with the clinical assessment of someone trained to read people. Emma stood straight, meeting his gaze without flinching. Sarah felt pride at that. The girl had come so far. "Mrs. Killian, Miss Wheaton." Hartwell dismounted, his clerk following suit. "Thomas has told me something of your situation, but I'd like to hear it from you directly. May we speak inside?" The line shack was small, dusty, abandoned for years, but it had a table and enough light coming through the gaps in the walls. Sarah had swept it clean that morning, arranged chairs, made it as presentable as possible. They settled around the table, Sarah and Emma on one side, the judge and his clerk on the other, Thomas standing by the door. "Before we begin," Hartwell said, pulling out a notebook, "I want to be clear about my position. I was sent to this territory because there have been numerous complaints about the administration of justice. My job is to determine whether those complaints have merit and, if so, to correct the situation. I have no loyalty to the settlements, no debts to local officials, no reason to protect anyone who's broken the law." He paused. "I also have no patience for false accusations or attention-seeking dramatics. I need the truth, whatever it is." Sarah respected the directness. Fair enough. She pulled out the oilcloth package, unwrapped Emma's mother's journal, and slid it across the table. "This is the testimony of Catherine Wheaton, Emma's mother. She died 2 weeks after Emma was sentenced, but before she died, she wrote down everything that happened, every threat, every pressure, every reason they really wanted Emma removed." Hartwell opened the journal, reading carefully. His clerk leaned in, taking notes. The silence stretched as the judge worked through the entries, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he looked up. "These are serious allegations. Conspiracy, attempted murder, corruption reaching to the highest levels of local law enforcement." He fixed his eyes on Emma. "Miss Wheaton, you're prepared to testify to the events described here?" "Yes, sir." Emma's voice was steady. "And to more. My mother didn't know everything. She didn't know I saw Sheriff Marsh meeting with the Carver brothers, the men who killed Marshal Killian 7 years ago. She didn't know I asked questions about why those men were treated like respectable citizens when everyone knew they'd ambushed a lawman. That's when the pressure on my family started. That's when Deacon Marsh began talking about my corruption and my need for correction." The judge's eyes sharpened. "You can identify these men. Place them in a meeting with Sheriff Marsh." "I can describe them. I saw them twice. Once at that meeting, once when they came to the general store where I was shopping. They were joking with the sheriff about old times, about how sometimes justice needs to look the other way." Emma's hands were steady on the table. "I was just a fat girl nobody paid attention to. They didn't think I mattered enough to watch what they said around me." "Their mistake," Hartwell said dryly. He turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Killian, Thomas tells me you were once a territorial marshal." Sarah nodded. "For 4 years. I served under Marshal Jacob Webb before marrying James Killian and passing my badge to him. I know the law, Judge, and I know when it's being twisted to serve powerful men instead of justice." "And you believe this conspiracy extends beyond Miss Wheaton's case?" "I know it does. James arrested the Carver brothers for rustling 7 years ago. He had evidence, witnesses, everything needed for conviction. They ambushed him before the trial, killed him, made it look like a road accident until I examined the body and saw powder burns that proved he'd been shot at close range. The territorial judge who heard the case ruled there wasn't enough evidence. Those same men are now walking free, meeting openly with the sheriff who's supposed to enforce the law against them." Hartwell closed the journal, his expression grim. "I'm going to be direct with both of you. What you're describing is a criminal conspiracy that could implicate half the officials in 3 settlements. Bringing charges will be dangerous. Witnesses have a way of disappearing, evidence gets lost, and judges who push too hard sometimes have unfortunate accidents. He met Sarah's eyes. I'm willing to pursue this because it's my job, and because I believe you're telling the truth, but you need to understand the risk. We understand, Sarah said. We're here anyway. Then here's what happens next. Hartwell pulled out several official-looking documents. I'm issuing a summons for a formal hearing in Redemption Flats to be held in 2 weeks. Sheriff Marsh, Deacon Marsh, and all members of the town council will be required to testify under oath. Miss Wheaton, you'll testify as well. Mrs. Killian, you'll present this journal as evidence and your own testimony regarding Marshal Killian's death. They'll try to stop it, Emma said. Let them try. I'm a territorial judge with full authority from the governor. Any attempt to interfere with this hearing is a federal offense. Hartwell's voice was steel. But Miss Wheaton is right to be concerned. Between now and the hearing, both of you are at risk. I'm assigning 2 deputy marshals to provide protection. They'll camp near your cabin, Mrs. Killian, and escort you both to Redemption Flats when the time comes. Sarah bristled slightly at the suggestion she needed protection, but she recognized the wisdom. 2 women alone were vulnerable in ways that pride couldn't overcome. Accepted, but they stay outside the cabin. I don't take well to strangers in my space. A hint of a smile crossed Hartwell's face. Understood. Now, there's something else you should know. Miss Wheaton isn't the only young woman who's disappeared from these settlements in the past 5 years. I've been reviewing records, talking to families. 3 others were sent away for various offenses. Moral failings, defiance, general unworthiness. Only one was ever seen again, and she died in a brothel in Silver City 6 months after her exile. Emma's face went pale. They've done this before. Multiple times. Your case is the first where someone intervened, where evidence was preserved, where the truth has a chance of coming to light. Hartwell's expression softened slightly. You're very fortunate Mrs. Killian found you when she did. No, Emma said quietly. They spent the next 2 hours going over details, preparing testimony, identifying other potential witnesses who might be willing to speak once they saw the tide turning. Hartwell's clerk documented everything, his pen scratching steadily across page after page. By the time they finished, the sun was lowering toward the mountains. One last thing, Hartwell said as they prepared to leave. Miss Wheaton, at the hearing, the defense will try to discredit you. They'll attack your character, your appearance, your moral fitness. They'll suggest you're lying, that you're vengeful, that you deserved what happened. Can you withstand that? Emma looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragement. Then she turned back to the judge. Judge Hartwell, they already tried to kill me. They chained me to a tree and left me to die in the sun. They took everything from me, my home, my family, my dignity. The worst they can do now is call me names. She straightened in her chair. I can handle that. What I can't handle is staying silent while they do it to someone else. Hartwell smiled, genuine warmth in it. You'll do fine, Miss Wheaton. I've seen hardened criminals break under less pressure than you've already survived. As they rode back toward the high country, the deputy marshals following at a respectful distance, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind that breaks at the first setback, but the solid, grounded hope that comes from seeing a path forward, however dangerous. We're really doing this, Emma said, her voice a mixture of fear and excitement. We're going to face them all, tell the truth in public where they can't silence it. We are, Sarah confirmed. And Emma, whatever happens at that hearing, you've already won. They tried to destroy you, and instead you survived, got stronger, and found the courage to fight back. That's victory right there. Emma was quiet for a moment. My mother wrote that she was sorry, that she wished she'd been braver. She touched the pocket where she now kept one page from the journal, her mother's final entry. "I'm doing this for her too, being the brave she couldn't be." That night, camped under the stars with the deputy marshals posted at the perimeter, Sarah lay awake thinking about the hearing to come. 2 weeks wasn't much time, but it was enough. Enough to prepare Emma, to gather whatever other evidence they could find, to make sure their testimony was unshakable. The settlements had grown comfortable in their corruption, secure in the knowledge that power protected power and the powerless had no recourse. They were about to learn different. They were about to face 2 women who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from speaking truth that had been buried too long. Sarah touched the marshal's badge in her pocket, the one she'd been carrying since showing it to Emma. Maybe she'd wear it to the hearing, remind them that she knew the law from the inside, that she'd once stood between chaos and civilization with nothing but her conviction that right mattered more than power. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. And in 2 weeks, justice would have its day in Redemption Flats, whether the settlements were ready for it or not. Judge Hartwell called Sarah to testify next. She walked to the chair with the confidence of someone who'd faced down armed outlaws and won. The badge on her chest caught the light, and she saw recognition flicker across older faces in the crowd, people who remembered when she'd worn it with authority. "Mrs. Killian," Hartwell began, "please state your relationship to the events in question." "I found Emma Wheaton dying under the cottonwood tree approximately 7 weeks ago. I cut her free, took her to my cabin, and nursed her back to health." Sarah's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "I also have personal knowledge of the corruption Miss Wheaton referenced regarding Marshal James Killian's death." She produced Catherine Wheaton's journal, now entered as official evidence, and read selected passages aloud, the entries detailing threats against Emma's family, the pressure to participate in Emma's sentencing, the revelation that Emma had witnessed Sheriff Marsh meeting with known criminals. The final entry, written the day before Catherine died, expressing regret and a determination to tell the truth. 2 weeks after she wrote that, Sarah said, Catherine Wheaton was dead. "Heart failure," the doctor said. "Convenient timing." The lawyer objected, but Hartwell overruled him. "Mrs. Killian is entitled to state her observations. The hearing will determine what weight to give them." Sarah continued, describing her own history with frontier justice. She told them about James's arrest of the Carver brothers, about the evidence he'd gathered, about the ambush that took his life. She explained how she'd examined his body, found powder burns proving he'd been shot at close range, documented everything for the territorial judge who'd come through months later. "That judge ruled there wasn't enough evidence," Sarah said. "The Carver brothers had alibis. Every man in their employ swore they were somewhere else. But, Judge, I know what a powder burn looks like. I know what an execution looks like. And I know what it looks like when powerful men close ranks to protect one of their own." She pulled out documentation she'd kept from James's case. Her own notes, crude drawings of the wound patterns, testimony from witnesses who'd later recanted. "I gave all this to the judge 7 years ago. He ignored it. The Carver brothers walked free. Now Emma Wheaton tells us Sheriff Marsh meets with these same men like old friends. That's not coincidence. That's proof of exactly what kind of law is being enforced in these settlements." The crowd was completely silent now. Even those who'd supported the sheriff, who'd participated in Emma's sentencing, couldn't ignore the evidence piling up before them. Judge Hartwell called Sheriff Marsh to testify. The sheriff walked to the chair with his head high, but Sarah saw the tightness around his eyes. He was a man who knew his world was crumbling. "Sheriff Marsh," Hartwell said, "do you deny meeting with the Carver brothers, the men suspected in Marshal Killian's death?" "I meet with lots of people. It's my job." "Do you deny that these particular men were involved in your predecessor's death?" "They were never convicted of anything." "That's not what I asked. Do you deny their involvement?" The sheriff's jaw worked. "I can't speak to what happened 7 years ago." "Can't or won't?" Hartwell leaned forward. Let me be clear, Sheriff. Your badge gives you authority, but it doesn't put you above the law. If you aided, abetted, or conspired to protect the men who killed a territorial marshal, that's a hanging offense. If you used your position to silence a witness to that conspiracy by arranging her removal and attempted murder, that's another hanging offense. I suggest you consider your answers carefully. The silence was absolute. Everyone in that hall held their breath. Finally, Sheriff Marsh spoke. The Carver brothers have been useful to me. They run cattle across 3 counties, employ men, keep order in their own way. When James Killian arrested them, it would have caused problems. Disrupted business. Made enemies. So you let them kill him, Hartwell said flatly. I didn't let them do anything. I just didn't investigate too hard afterward. The sheriff's voice was defiant now, past the point of pretense. James was a good man, but he didn't understand how things work out here. Sometimes keeping the peace means looking the other way. Sometimes justice has to bend. And Emma Wheaton, did she need to bend? She saw something she shouldn't have. Started asking questions that could have reopened James's case. The deacon and I agreed she was a problem that needed solving. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Sarah saw faces in the crowd shift from denial to horror to shame. They'd participated in this, either actively or through their silence. They'd let it happen. Deacon Marsh tried to speak, to explain, but Judge Hartwell cut him off. I've heard enough. Sheriff Marsh, you're relieved of your badge and your authority, effective immediately. Deacon Marsh, you're stripped of your position in the church pending a full investigation. Both of you will be held in custody awaiting trial for conspiracy to commit murder. The deputy marshals moved forward, but Sheriff Marsh stood on his own, removing his badge and setting it on the table. He looked at Emma one time, and something like regret flickered across his face. Then he looked at Sarah, and there was only resignation. You were always trouble, Sarah Killian, he said quietly. James was too. Maybe that's why you belonged. Together. Maybe, Sarah agreed. Or maybe we just believed the law meant something. As the marshals led the sheriff and the deacon out, the crowd erupted. Some shouted approval, others protest. Judge Hartwell banged his gavel, calling for order, declaring the hearing concluded. The truth was out now, documented and official. Justice, long delayed, was finally being served. 3 months after the hearing, Sarah stood on the porch of Emma's new cabin, watching the young woman teach 3 children their letters. The cabin sat on land the territorial government had granted Emma as restitution, 80 acres of good bottomland near Iron Creek, with water rights and timber enough to build properly. Emma had designed it herself, with Sarah's help, making it sturdy and practical, and hers. The teaching had started almost by accident. A widow from Iron Creek had asked if Emma might tutor her daughter, who'd fallen behind after illness kept her from the traveling school teacher's circuit. Emma had agreed, discovering she had both the patience and the gift for it. Now 3 children came twice a week, and more families were asking. Sound it out, Emma was saying now, patient with a boy struggling over a word. Take your time. The letters aren't going anywhere. Sarah sipped her coffee, feeling the autumn sun warm on her face. The high country would be snowed in soon, but she'd be spending this winter down here, in the cabin she'd built on land adjoining Emma's. Close enough to help if needed, far enough to give them both space. The solitude she'd once craved felt different now, not an escape from the world, but a choice to engage with it on her own terms. A rider appeared on the trail. Thomas Brennan making his regular supply run. He'd taken over more responsibilities at his father's store, proving himself reliable and discreet. He'd also become something like a friend, one of the few from the settlements who'd consistently chosen right over easy. Mrs. Killian, Miss Emma, he called, dismounting. Got mail for you both, and news if you want to hear it. Emma finished with the children, sending them off with assignments and encouragement. They ran laughing down the trail, and Sarah marveled at how normal that seemed. Children being children, learning and growing without the weight of judgment crushing them. "What's the news?" Emma asked, wiping chalk dust from her hands. "Trial set for next month. Helena. Judge Hartwell will preside." Thomas pulled letters from his saddlebag. "Sheriff Marsh is pleading guilty to obstruction. The Carver brothers were arrested last week. Seems once the sheriff started talking, he couldn't stop. They'll face charges for Marshal Killian's murder." Sarah felt something settle in her chest, a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. Justice for James, finally. 7 years late, but better than never. "Deacon Marsh," Emma asked. "Fighting it. Claims he was just enforcing community standards. Didn't intend actual harm." Thomas shook his head. "Nobody's believing it, though. Not after 4 other families came forward about daughters who'd been removed for various offenses. Territorial investigator found 2 of them, both alive, but barely. Stories similar to yours, Miss Emma." Emma's hand went to her throat. "They're safe now." "They are. Judge Hartwell's making sure they get restitution, same as you, and he's pushing for new territorial laws. Oversight for community punishments, rights of the accused, protection for witnesses." Thomas smiled slightly. "Your testimony made a difference. Real difference." After Thomas left, Sarah and Emma sat on the porch together, reading their mail. Sarah had a letter from Judge Hartwell, offering her a position as territorial marshal in the Northern District. The same badge she'd once worn, the same authority she'd once wielded. The job was hers if she wanted it. She read the letter twice, considering. Part of her wanted it. The purpose, the work, the chance to serve justice properly. But another part, the part that had learned something these past months, hesitated. "You should take it," Emma said, having read over her shoulder. "You'd be good at it, better than good. Maybe, or maybe I've done my part." Sarah folded the letter carefully. "I spent 4 years as a marshal before, then 7 years hiding in the mountains after everything fell apart. Maybe now I just want to live quiet and help where I can help." "You saved my life," Emma said softly. "That's helping. You saved yourself. I just gave you the space to do it." Sarah looked at the younger woman, seeing the transformation complete. Emma was healthy, purposeful, confident in ways that had nothing to do with what others thought of her. "You're teaching now, building a life, that's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the valley below. Smoke rose from chimneys in Iron Creek. Cattle grazed in distant pastures. The frontier went about its business, slightly better for their having fought to change it. "I wrote to my father," Emma said eventually. "Told him about the cabin, the teaching, asked if he wanted to visit. Did he respond? Not yet. Maybe he won't." Emma's voice was steady, accepting. "I've made peace with that. He made his choices, I've made mine. But I wanted him to know I survived, that I'm happy, that his silence didn't break me." Sarah reached over and squeezed Emma's hand. "You're stronger than most people will ever be." "I had good teaching." Emma squeezed back. That evening, Sarah walked back to her own cabin as the sun set behind the mountains. She'd write to Judge Hartwell tomorrow, declining the marshal position but offering to serve as a consultant when needed. She'd lived enough years carrying badges and fighting others' battles. Now she'd fight only when necessary, help where she could, and spend her remaining years in something approaching peace. The cabin was small, but well built, with a good stove and comfortable bed. Her books lined the shelves, James's badge sat in a place of honor, and Mary's quilt covered the bed. The ghosts that had haunted her felt quieter now, not gone, but reconciled. She'd done what she could for Mary by saving Emma. She'd honored James by seeing his killers finally brought to justice. As night fell, Sarah lit a lamp and sat at her desk, pulling out paper to write her response to the judge. Through the window, she could see the light from Emma's cabin, warm and steady in the darkness. Two women who'd been broken by the frontier's cruelty, now rebuilt and purposeful on their own terms. The frontier would keep being harsh. People would keep making hard choices, sometimes wrong ones. But maybe in some small way, things were better for their having fought back. Maybe the next Emma Wheaton would have someone who'd stand up for her sooner. Maybe the next corrupt official would think twice, knowing that power didn't guarantee impunity. Sarah finished her letter, sealed it, and set it aside for Thomas to collect on his next visit. Then she poured herself a glass of whiskey, raised it in silent toast to James and Mary, and drank to the future, uncertain as always, but no longer defined entirely by loss. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the valley below, a young woman taught children their letters by lamplight, building a better world, one small lesson at a time. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.